here today. First, just let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm from Minnesota originally. I grew up in a small town just north of the Twin Cities, and my bachelor's is in psychology. It's from St. Cloud State. And then I also have a master's in experimental psychology. That's from the University of Wisconsin. And then I went down to Florida to get my PhD, which is in gerontology, or the study of aging. And my research is in like cognitive aging, functional aging. I do a lot of research on driving and older adults. I also do research on dementia and attitudes toward dementia. And I actually brought a survey that I'm doing in my lab. So and I'm looking for people who are middle-aged or older to take the survey.
That's what I thought.
And so if you want to do that, it's over there. You can pick it up and then turn it back in, and you can enter a $25 gift card drawing if you do the survey. So that would be great. Okay, and I've got a brief presentation today about transitions that take place with aging, and then ageism. And then Dale's going to talk about Social Security and Medicare, so programs like that. Okay, so my presentation, I'm going to talk about aging, transitions that take place with aging, and then I'll talk about what ageism is, yes?
What's the operational definition of middle age?
Somewhere like starts around the age 40 until age 65. It's really kind of arbitrary. Kind of arbitrary. Okay, then I'll talk a little bit about how ageism has kind of evolved in the United States, experiences of ageism, and maybe we can share some if you have any, and then stereotypes about aging and how that affects people. Okay, so I teach in the Department of Human Development and Family Science, and so all of our professors there cover the whole lifespan. So there's some that specialize in infancy, early childhood, there's some that specialize in adolescence, and then I specialize in aging, so we try to cover the whole lifespan. And every stage of the lifespan is different and important, like for the development of a whole person. And actually, if you think of development as like a timeline, people think of there's usually divide up into different stages. So there's the prenatal period, then there's infancy, then childhood, then adolescence, and then adulthood is the longest, by far the longest period of the lifespan. So that's like right there, that's like at least 2/3 of the whole lifespan is spent in adulthood, and older adulthood has come to take up a larger and larger part of the lifespan. So it's been a neglected part traditionally. Like no one really wanted to study aging. I mean, everyone wants to learn about children, but not so much aging. But it's important to think about older adults and aging because the population is growing tremendously, and that's really unprecedented. It hasn't happened before in the history of modern societies where we have so many people living so long. And the definition of older adults is kind of arbitrary too, like what you said about middle age. Well, older adults, like in gerontology, we usually think of the cutoff as 65, but that's just because that's what the government set for getting Social Security, and so that's like just a convenient kind of cutoff, but it's not like at any point you just suddenly become old. Like there's no age where you just suddenly become old. And the older you get, then the older you have to be before you actually think of someone as being old. Like for myself, I don't think of people as being old until they're over in their 80s. So I don't think of 65 as being old. But in research, older adults, it's usually 65 is the cutoff. And that population, by the year 2050, is projected to make up a whole fifth of the whole United States population. Is going to be over 65. So that's a lot of people. People have a lot of company at that point, and you can see in this graph just how much the population is expected to grow, and that includes people over 65 and 85, which is like the oldest old people, all expected to grow quite a bit. And life expectancies increased, doubled. So this is life expectancy from birth. So it includes, infant mortality, which used to be a lot higher. But it was 47 in 1900, and then now in 2000 it was 77.5 in the United States, and it keeps increasing. There are some countries like Japan, where it's over 80 life expectancy from birth. And life expectancy is actually the average age where a person born in a certain year would be expected to die based on life tables and things like that. So you could think of it as you have like a 50% chance of reaching that particular age. So 50% will die before then and 50% after who are born in a certain year. But now that most people will make it to age 50, I read 98% of people will live to age 50 now. So people aren't dying in childhood like they used to. They're not dying at younger ages. So you have a good chance if you're born of making it into old age now. And why are people living longer? Well, like I mentioned, infant mortality is lower. So if you're born, you have a good shot at getting to be old now. Better nutrition, better medical treatments. I mean, there's a lot of advances in treating, the main causes of death, like heart disease, cancer. You can live a lot longer with certain health conditions now. Improved sanitation practices, that's huge. And you think of like chronological age as being important, like the number of years you've been alive. But actually, health is a lot more important than age. So you've heard the cliche of, you're as old as you feel, and that's actually pretty true. So age per se isn't nearly as important as your health. And as you know, if you think of like your friends, your family, there's such a lot of variability in how people age. I mean, you can take different people at age 65 and some are running marathons and they look good, and then some are in wheelchairs and they're totally disabled. So there's a lot of variability, and it all comes down to health. So there's a lot of transitions people experience as they move through adulthood. The one, if you have children, is like empty nest. It's when they grow up and they leave the home. And then becoming a grandparent, great-grandparent, and so forth is another transition. And then people have to deal with physical changes, as your body gets older, and relationship changes as, other people get sick or people pass away. And the older you get, the more exposure you have to ageism, which is why I'm going to kind of talk about ageism a little bit. And retirement's a big transition for a lot of people, and then when you first qualify for Social Security and Medicare, which is what Dale's going to talk about. Okay, so we'll talk about ageism now. So there's like 3 isms. There's sexism, ageism, and racism. And so, like when you meet someone for the first time, people tend to classify them based on their gender, based on their race, and then based on their perceived age. And it's really ingrained. Like if you think of when you read a news report about someone, they always have their age after their name, like so-and-so, and then their age. And I mean, isn't it kind of weird if they don't? Like if you're reading about someone and you don't know how old they are? Like, do you want to know how old they are? And then like, why is it important to know how old they are? Why does it matter? It just does, doesn't it? I mean, like, you want to picture the person, like what they might look like and what you might expect them to act like based on their age. So knowing someone's age helps you kind of picture what they might be like just based on their age. And ageism is stereotyping, which is thoughts, prejudice, which is behaviors, and then, stereotyping, prejudice is actually thoughts, feelings, and then discrimination is behaviors, just based on a person's perceived age or their known chronological age. Ageism can actually be against any age group. So you think of it as being about older people, but younger people can experience ageism too. Especially like in the workforce, like if someone looks really young, like people don't take them seriously and things like that. But when you think about ageism against older people, it's unique because it's really about yourself, because you're going to get old someday. And if you are old, and then there's ageism, it's really about yourself. And so that makes it kind of unusual. And it's especially prevalent in the United States. It is changing as the number of older people grows and the baby boomers get older. And, they brought a lot of social change and will continue to do so. But ageism you still see it quite a bit in the United States. And it wasn't always like that. It's actually a pretty recent thing. It's followed kind of the Industrial Revolution. So in colonial times, not as many people lived to be older, and so those that did were more respected, were a more select group. That they tended to own property, like family farms and things like that, so they would control resources, and thus they had higher status positions, they were respected in their families, respected in their communities. And relationships between the younger and older generations tended to be more formal in the past. And there were people that were older who were poor, and like immigrants, widows, and those people did tend to have lower status, but for the most part, elders were a lot more respected in colonial times because they controlled more resources and they were a more select group of people. But then with the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, older people's power kind of diminished as younger people moved to urban areas. So there weren't as many younger people staying on the family farms and inheriting the property because they would of out-migration, which we still see in North Dakota now, where younger people leave, to go to more urban areas for jobs. Life expectancy increased, so it wasn't as special, to live to be older, and retirement became more common. So, not so long ago, people just worked until they couldn't work anymore because there was no safety net, like they needed the money, but retirement became more common, especially with, more factory jobs. People couldn't do the physical labor, and when people retired, then they didn't have as much money, so that reduced their power, and our culture just became more youth-centric, more centered on being young, and so then that's how ageism kind of came about. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to ageism today. There's a lot of cultural values that kind of favor younger people, like youthful looks, and you have to look young. And rapid technological change, it's really hard to keep up, as I'm sure you know, with all the latest developments in technology, because you learn one thing and then it's obsolete already, especially with computers and phones. And I've heard a lot of older people say they just get tired of, trying to keep up with everything. And so that can lead to generation gaps between younger and older people, where the younger people might feel like the older people are out of touch, with modern society and things like that. Fear of death definitely plays a role in ageism, because no one likes to think about, eventually we're all going to die, and older people are closer to death, and so they kind of make people think about that. No one wants to think about that. How the media portrays aging definitely contributes, and then age segregation. So, like, there's communities that are 55 plus and things where there aren't younger people, and then younger people tend to not interact with a lot of older people. Like, they kind of stick together too, and so that contributes. Okay, media portrayals of aging. So the media kind of it creates attitudes in society, but also reflects the attitudes that are there already. And if you think of how older people are portrayed in the media, there tends to be a lot of stereotypes. And older people are better represented now, like in television and movies, but still not usually in leading roles, and especially not with women. So leading roles tend to go to people that look younger, and just unrealistic portrayals of aging. So like the advertisements, if you think of commercials that show older people, they're all like youthful, skinny looking, like grandparent like figures, and they don't look like real older people. And there's oversimplified kind of characters that are stereotypes, and there's gender differences. So you see, like, it's okay to be an older man, like you can get more roles if you're an actor and you're an older man, but for women, like, if you don't look young, then you tend to not be portrayed in the media.
There's been a whole lot of stuff about that in the in the paper and in the media lately.
Oh, has there? Okay, so how ageism is kind of manifested in our culture. So these are ways we see ageism in our culture. One thing is just trying to hide one's age, like especially older women And it's like a compliment to tell people, oh, you look young, like you look good for your age, you look younger than your age. And people don't like to tell how old they are, and that's that's because of ageism. And that especially applies to women. That's called like a double standard, because older women just aren't seen as attractive as older men, and that's why cosmetic surgery, makeup, dyeing hair, things like that. Women do more of that stuff, but it's okay to be a man and look older. And people, so you see like discrimination in the workplace, like you hear all the time about lawsuits, for age discrimination in the workplace. You hear about older workers like being let go and replaced with younger workers, and you hear about that all the time. It's harder to find a job when you're older. And actually, I remember it was a few years ago, there was an experiment done. I think it was on 2020 or 60 Minutes or one of those shows. It was years ago. But I remember, like, they had an actor dress up like an older guy. Do you remember something about that too, Catherine? Yeah, an actor dressed up like an older man and then a younger man and went on job interviews. And it was the exact same person, but the younger version got more positive feedback and more job offers than the older version. So it just shows it is harder to get a job when you're older. And you see discrimination in healthcare, so doctors might not be as aggressive at treating an older person, because they might think, well, they're older, they're frail, they're just not going to live very long anyway. And so you see things like that. And if you don't follow like the norms for your age, or if you don't, or the rules for like how you're supposed to act at a certain age, like if you do something like you wear clothes, that you're not supposed to wear, or you do activities, like you see older people like going skydiving and things like that. You might get criticized for doing that if you don't follow the rules, if you're doing things, or if you're dating like younger people, there's criticism for that. And so not following like the norms, the rules for your age are seen as being bad. Elder abuse is kind of an extreme manifestation of ageism, so people actually mistreating older people. And then all the stereotypes that are out there about older people and aging, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Okay, when you think of like what a stereotype is, it's not necessarily a bad thing. All it is just a belief that's kind of oversimplified that you apply to people without knowing them very well. And it lets people make quick judgments about other people, and sometimes those judgments are accurate. I mean, we all know people that fit stereotypes, and stereotypes don't come out of nowhere. I mean, they come out of, like seeing people that actually fit the stereotypes, and then kind of overgeneralizing it. Stereotypes can be, they're not always negative, they can be positive too. The problem, like with age stereotypes, is that they become self-fulfilling and they affect people's self-esteem. So if people believe in like the negative stereotypes about aging, it affects how they feel about themselves and actually how they actually perform, like on cognitive abilities and things like that. So, but with aging, there's definitely positive and negative stereotypes. So it's not all negative. Okay, so just think of what are some negative stereotypes that you can think of about aging that you've heard, or about older people?
I was just thinking that, and in between recessions we'll do it, but we have to go to the bathroom all the time.
We have to go to the bathroom.
That's what they think of us, so that's what's true.
Yes.
What's another one?
Most younger people talk louder to you because they think you're deaf because you're older.
Oh, yeah.
And just, I am, but it kind of irritates you. They think that you're old and decrepit.
Mm-hmm. That you're hard of hearing. Yeah, it's hard though because a lot of older people are, and then like if you don't talk loud enough, they'll be like, well, I can't hear you. But then if you talk, so what do you do?
At least they talk to them.
Well, they're not necessarily talking to you, they're talking at you.
Like if you're talking down to you, or at you, that's something. What about like older people and driving? Like you hear about older people being bad drivers and slow and stuff all the time.
Well, I feel that's just the opposite in my thinking. You know, the younger drivers are the bad drivers. The older ones are the ones with more insurance and more experience.
That's true. And studies actually show that that's true. Up until about age 75 or so. That is the case, that older people, because of their greater experience, are better drivers.
I have a father, I'm trying to get his car keys away from him now at 89.
Oh.
That's not going so good.
Oh, they never want to give up their car keys. Okay, so with the negative stereotypes, I mean, they all have they have different themes, like illness, so like older people being sick or frail, not being physically attractive, being senile, like mental decline, being lonely, isolated, depressed, not being of much use anymore. And then there are some positive stereotypes, though, like older people being wise, like you hear about wisdom in older people, and that's not necessarily the case. You can be older but still not be wise. And leadership, so like you see in the media, sometimes older people are portrayed as like the matriarch or patriarch of the family, and like a good leader. And then there's a kindness kind of positive stereotype, like the grandmother that bakes cookies and is really sweet and nurturing would fit that category. And if we had internet access here, there's some commercials on YouTube that are really kind of funny and that show like stereotypes of older people, but you can find them and you can see them on TV too. I've seen quite a few commercials that it's funny, but poking fun at older people. Oh, but I do have some cartoons here that we can look at about older people. So, like, what kind of message is being communicated by this cartoon?
Well, I mean, and I make this statement all the time, but like with cell phones and that kind of stuff, my grandchildren are the one who teach me how to run them.
So it's like, the stereotype that older people can't use technology.
Some of us were talking yesterday at lunch where we go to our children's homes to watch their children or check the house or whatever, and you think you're going to watch their TV and you don't know how to turn it on. I mean, there's like every contraption, you don't know which button is even turning it on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's somewhat the case. It's just because everything changes so much. Like it's impossible to keep up with it. But then there's this one, and so what's kind of the message here? I mean, it's not all negative.
Might be as young as you feel.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like, well, they're jogging, and that's good, but then they're talking about memory loss. But memory loss, yeah, maybe it isn't always bad.
I might be old, but I refuse to grow up.
Yeah. Okay, and then that one's hard to see, but it says, there was another shirt that said 50 and looks it, but I decided I better not get that for him. So the shirt says 50 and proud of it instead of 50 and looks it.
Oh.
That'd be funny. Okay, and then this is my favorite one. Can you read that one?
Oh.
I like that one.
Alan was sexist.
Yeah. But still, like, frisky.
I like the cat.
Old and frisky. There you go.
Okay, so there's lots of cartoons and commercials and stuff like that. Young people actually kind of internalize stereotypes about aging at a really young age. So their attitudes, are shaped by interacting with, family members, by media, and by about age 5, they have very clear attitudes about older people and about aging. That's what research shows. And studies have shown, older people, that children think older people is like a time of decline. I mean, they might see, grandparents getting sick or dying or whatever. And so it's important that children have positive interactions with older people, so they see that it's not all a bad time. And young adults, like college students, there's been a lot of research on college students and their attitudes. And it shows that they really have mixed feelings about older people. Like they tend to think of them as like sweet but frail, or like really kind but just not very competent and strong. So they have mixed stereotypes, mixed feelings about aging. And when you ask older people themselves how they feel, so like when you're younger, you don't really think about what it's going to be like when you get older. And then when you find that you are older, because it just happens, older people say that they feel like they're the same person as they always were, if not in a lot of ways better. So they feel like they're kind of ageless, like they just feel like themselves. That's what they say. And I'm sure that's true for you, like you just feel like the same person as always. And most older people say that they're not lonely, they're not depressed, that they're pretty satisfied with life. But if they believe in like negative stereotypes, like older people are senile, you're supposed to get slower and whatnot, that can actually become self-fulfilling. So it's really important to be positive. And this graph here, so there's been studies done on negative stereotypes and whether they're self-fulfilling, and this is from a study of memory tests. So they gave people memory tests, and then they put, so it was older people, and they were in different groups, and one group was reminded of, like, older people don't do as well on these tests, and then one group wasn't reminded of these negative stereotypes, and the group that was reminded, that older people